everyone, Beth Sager here with the Lex Local, and today I get to interview a prominent author in town, Helen Epstein. Thank you for doing this.
You're very welcome.
So, did you always want to write?
Did I always want to write? No. I actually wanted to be a Broadway musical star when I was a kid. I lived very close to Broadway in Manhattan.
All right.
And I went to a lot of matinees as a child, and my idea was to grow up and become Julie Andrews.
Wow.
But that didn't happen.
No. Not at all?
Not at all. I was really tall most of my life. And so I was also quite awkward on a stage. So even though I could sing and I could memorize all the lyrics, that was not going to be my life, unfortunately. But when I was 20, I got caught in the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and that's what jump-started my journalism career.
Wow. Okay. What brought you there?
I was born in Prague. And my parents left because of the communist takeover in 1948 and came to the United States. And I always wanted to go back there, but those were the days of the Cold War and you couldn't go. And finally, when I was a student, I was able to go. And unfortunately, a couple of days after I arrived, the Soviet army arrived.
Oof. And
so I got stuck.
That's scary.
It was very scary. And I got stuck in an apartment in Prague, and there was a typewriter. And so I started typing, and when I got evacuated, I mailed what I had written to 2 newspapers, and one of them published it. And from that time on, I was a published writer. And all through college, I worked as a journalist. And then...
Did you go to school in Europe or here?
I went to school actually in Israel. I went to school in Jerusalem at Hebrew University.
Oh, you've been all over the place.
Right. And I worked for the Jerusalem Post, was my first newspaper.
Cool. All right. Yeah. So you started writing for newspapers, then what happened?
Then I went to the Columbia School of Journalism back in New York, where my parents were still living. And I did journalism school, and then I decided I didn't want to work for newspapers. I wanted to write longer pieces. I was interested in magazine writing and eventually books. And so I started freelancing as a magazine journalist and started writing for the Sunday New York Times, which was, of course, my home newspaper. So I was lucky in that regard. And very soon I discovered that I really liked arts journalism because I liked hanging out with musicians and theater people and watching rehearsals. So that became my specialty. But I didn't want to work full-time for magazines or newspapers because it was just too much of a hustle. So I got a teaching job, and I became the first tenured woman professor in NYU's journalism department.
Wow, good for you.
So that was a whole other part of my life. Okay. So I have about 1,000 who I taught who are now doing journalism all across the United States, which is nice.
Impressive. That's nice. Very nice. Yeah. So at what point did you write a book?
Well, my idea was, from the time I was in journalism school, was to write longer and longer and longer because I like in-depth, immersive work. And so I started working on the subject of my first book, which was intergenerational transmission of trauma, in the 1970s while I was teaching. And I wrote some articles about it. And one article was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in June of 1977. And of course, if you have an article, especially back then, if you had an article on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, people came to you with book offers. That was my first book. So that book is called Children of the Holocaust. It was published in 1979. And it's really an internationally known book. It exists in many translations. It really solidified my relationship with Czechoslovakia and what's now the Czech Republic. And I go there very often, and I'm going there again this spring to talk about my books and to teach. So all of these things, journalism, publishing, and speaking, have all come together for me.
Wow. That's nice. That's a great plan, right? Like, who
It's
knew?
a lovely thing because you can do it anywhere, especially now with the internet. And it's been very nice to be able to do it from this lovely place in Lexington because I really like living here and I don't have to be in the city to write.
Right. Yeah. So now I see you're also writing for our local Observer. That's quite nice.
Right. Well, one of the few things I hadn't done in journalism was I hadn't ever written for a local newspaper because, as I said, my local newspaper was the New York Times, and that's not exactly a small town newspaper. So when Lauren Feeney, the editor, asked me to do some stuff, I was really happy to, and I really enjoy it. It's, you know, by the time you're my age, I'm 77, you really aren't surprised by anything, but I was really surprised by local journalism. I think it's very different to write about people who are your neighbors and who you'll meet in the supermarket or on the street. And also, these are people who will talk to you about what you've written and give you feedback, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And accuracy is really important. I mean, if you don't get things right, you really hear about it. Right. So I really liked it. And it gave me opportunities to meet very different people than I would have met in my usual line of work. So I've really been enjoying it.
So the theme of your book, was that just like what piqued your interest about something like that?
Well, yeah, my parents were Holocaust survivors, and all four of my grandparents were murdered in the war. And so our family was not only an immigrant family. My parents came to New York as middle-aged Czech people who my father didn't speak English at all. My mother spoke very good English. But so I had the immigrant experience as well as the child of genocide experience. And it was always something I wanted to write about. But at the same time, I was very interested in arts journalism. So I wrote a book, a whole bunch of my profiles of musicians are collected in a book called Music Talks. And I wrote a biography, the only biography, of the theater producer Joseph Papp, who was the man who invented Free Shakespeare. He started Free Shakespeare in Central Park in the 1950s. And so in addition to this intergenerational trauma sort of theme in my work, there's the arts journalism. And then there's a third thing, which is, of course, because I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, I was very affected by second wave feminism. And I wrote a maternal history of my family, very much like the Chinese book Wild Swans. Mine is called Where She Came From, and it's about 3 generations of women in Central Europe, and it follows their lives. They have my 3 generations of women, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my mother all happen to have been seamstresses and dress designers, which you couldn't tell looking at me, but that was their passion. And so that book is basically a women's history of Central Europe. And that's the one I always ask people to look at first because it's very serious. And that book was occasioned by my mother's death. My mother died when I was 40 in 1989. And I spent the next 10 years basically researching her life and her family life. And then I wrote medical memoir. I wrote a book about having cancer here and during COVID, actually, cancer during COVID, and my treatment at MGH, which was really excellent. And if anyone who's watching is interested in reading about, if anyone is interested in how you get through it and how treatment works here in the Boston area, I think I had an exemplary treatment. It was 5 years ago, and I'm at the 5-year cancer-free moment right now. So that's lovely. So now I'm working on, in addition to working for our local paper, I work for an arts journal called The Arts Fuse, so I get to review books, and if I want to review concerts and theater, which is nice. And now what I'm thinking about writing is a memoir of being a journalist when there still was traditional journalism. Because, of course, our field is in crisis. I just learned that Google has refused to honor the the word Gulf of Mexico, all of us have been writing and saying, change it back, and
Right.
they basically stopped comments on it. So my profession is in crisis, and I am working on a book hoping to alert people to how important journalism is.
Right. I agree. It is important. So, thank you. Thank you for your time.
You're very
Nice to
welcome.
meet you.
Thank you for your visit.
Sure.